So a lot of the times for many years when I would see there was a arrest as it relates to a med spa or a medical facility, it's because there was unlicensed individuals doing something they shouldn't have done and they maimed or killed someone.
This is Med Spa Mayhem, the podcast all about the chaotic world of medical aesthetics. From Botox to lasers to IV bars, learn how to tell real versus fake, legal versus illegal, and safe versus potentially deadly. Hear the crazy stories inside the med spa world and find out what questions to ask and how to spot the people cutting corners. I'm your host, Dr. Kate D. Together, we explore the wild west of medicine that is the aesthetics industry. Today, I'm speaking with Brad Adato, the only lawyer I know who can make healthcare law fun and entertaining. He's going to help shine a light on what the laws are that govern med spas so we can understand better what corners are being cut and what laws are routinely being broken in the aesthetics industry. Hi, this is Dr. Kate D, and welcome back to Med Spa Mayhem. Today, as my guest, I'm having Brad Adato on to talk about Med Spa Law 101. Brad went to Texas Christian University, graduating in 1994. Then he went to Loyola University School of Law, getting his JD in 1998. Brad's background is in regulatory, transactional, and securities law. Having worked in healthcare law his entire career, he has really, truly an in-depth knowledge of the do's and don'ts of the med spa industry. So, Brad, thanks so much for being here today.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be on this podcast. I know I'm your first season, so that's really exciting for me.
Yeah, well, it's been kind of a whirlwind. And just for full disclosure for everybody at home, Brad is my healthcare attorney. So he is the source of most of my knowledge about healthcare law. And when in doubt, I just defer to him. So he's the guy. And I really wanted to bring you on here today to just talk about the basics of med spa law, because I think that most people really have absolutely no idea what the laws are. And this actually includes not only patients and consumers, but people actually practicing within it.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's just start by defining like what is a med spa or what constitutes the practice of medicine.
Yeah, and it's a great question because a lot of times people will say, I'm just a med spa, so I'm not really practicing medicine. And they don't realize the impact is, no. The practice of medicine is basically the easiest way to describe it, or the summary we use that most states look at it is basically anytime you're affecting living tissue. So that could be freezing the fat, that could be burning the fat, that could be piercing the skin itself, and of course, coming up with a diagnosis and treatment plan. So one of those elements ends up becoming the practice of medicine, and in the vast majority of the med spas or medi spas, they're going to be doing some sort of service line that will freeze, burn, or pierce the skin.
Yeah, and I would say in my medical spa, we do a couple of things that are not the practice of medicine. Like we do facials.
Sure.
And we do some exfoliation treatments like dermaplaning and microdermabrasion. But just about everything else we do is considered the practice of medicine. And that includes even just microneedling going into the dermis, like 1 to 2 millimeters is the practice of medicine.
Yeah. Microneedling is probably the most evil thing to talk about, Kate. It's just because it's all over the place about how people view it. So it's one of the questions I definitely dislike answering.
Okay, I promise not to ask you about microneedling. I can probably answer questions about microneedling if anybody
I was about to say, it's
wants to hear about that.
Dependent. But to your point which is so interesting about medical spas or medi spas is that there are a lot of spa services in there. So I know groups that have massages and other types of things that have nothing to do with the practice of medicine, but that they utilize that because it's a tool in which they can have someone come in and get full treatment of their body.
Right. And I have seen many spas where they start out as a day spa with massage and facials, whatever, and they decide, oh, it'll be lucrative to add on some medical services. And those people have no idea that all of a sudden they're moving into an entire different, very highly regulated area of law and into the practice of medicine. I think they actually don't necessarily know.
Totally agree.
And I've seen some where it's like a day spa and they want to hire a nurse to come do Botox once a week. And they don't realize like everything about that's illegal. So let's get into that. The first question is really who can practice medicine? So by law, and I know that a lot of things vary by state, but in general, who can practice medicine?
So obviously the easiest answer is physicians are the people who can practice medicine. Then physicians, based on their, as you said, state dependent, can then delegate certain services to other individuals. And as you're very well aware of, is some of those individuals are the higher. So you'd have your physician assistant who can practice under that delegation or collaboration, depending on your state, with that physician. You also have nurse practitioners who meet those same criteria. And in several states now, nurse practitioners are more autonomous, but they're not really practicing medicine so much as practicing advanced nursing. And then on top of that, again, depending on our state, we can then, that physician or nurse practitioner, PA, sometimes can delegate down to a registered nurse. Or in some other states, they can delegate to medical assistants to do stuff. So it's really is state dependent. So if you want me to give you an example, like for example, here in Texas, where I'm seated today, a physician can delegate to anyone up and down the food chain so long as they believe they have the proper skill set. While in California, which is just south of you, they cannot. If it's a medical procedure, they can only delegate to an RN or higher. So going back to who can practice, that's going to be very state dependent.
So essentially, what you're saying is that, for lack of a better word, there's a hierarchy. So there's the doctor who's allowed to practice independently, basically everywhere.
Right.
And that includes MDs and DOs, and I don't want to get into that, but those are both considered doctors. And then PAs and NPs have about the same amount of education, but PAs are practicing medicine. So technically they're governed by the medical board and they're practicing medicine.
Right.
Whereas nurse practitioners have about the same amount of education as PAs, but they're actually practicing nursing. And I think their degree is technically called advanced nursing, right? Or ARNP. So, and then underneath that are registered nurses. And they are, like the nurses that you might be familiar with in a doctor's office or in a hospital. And underneath that are medical assistants who basically don't actually some states don't require any education or certificate at all to be an MA. I think some do.
Yeah.
So
to add to the list, Kate, is that you have your LPNs or in some states where they have it's a more of an advanced degree in administrative work for nursing, but that typically doesn't mean they can always do medical procedures. So that's someone will say, "Oh, she's a nurse," and I go, "Oh, what kind of nurse?" They're like, "Oh, she's an LPN." I'm like, "That's not exactly a registered nurse. That's somebody who can help with on the hospital side or a doctor's office, but they can't always draw blood or they can't always do piercings and stuff of that sort."
Right. And that's a licensed practical nurse, or in some states it's called an LVN, licensed vocational nurse, but they can't even do really all the things that an RN can do. So we've talked about who can practice medicine. Separately, we've talked about also who can inject Botox or perform certain medical procedures. And interestingly, Texas, you said that doctors can decide basically anybody can do that. Is Texas the only state? This has come up in a few conversations that we've had on this podcast in the past. Is Texas the only state? Someone recently told me that Idaho was like that as well. Is that true?
There's probably about 10 or 15 states that ultimately at the end of the day, between the way the medical board views it or how the statute's written, it's the discretion of the physician. So another state is going to be Nevada and Virginia. And those states, meaning that if you, the physician, believe that individual has a skill set to do it, you can delegate to them. Now, that doesn't understand, so let's talk about Texas again. In Texas, if you delegate to someone, you have to be immediately available if they're below a certain level. Well, Nevada, if I delegate it to an RN, I still have to be on site. If I delegate it to a medical assistant, I still have to be on site. So the supervision piece becomes a lot more intrusive in certain states versus others.
So the case that we've talked about on this podcast before, of the patient who died in Texas last summer, where she went to a med spa and got an IV and died very quickly there. The practitioner had no license at all. And the medical director was over 100 miles away and really didn't spend any time at that med spa. In Texas, in order for that all to be legal, the medical director was supposed to actually be on site the whole time.
No, that's Nevada. So
Oh, that's Nevada.
I
Okay.
can talk at length on that particular case. I can give you a little more detail. So you had a physician who was over 100 miles away, and by crows, I mean, if you got in a car and drove from where this office was and where the location was, it's probably about an hour and 25 minute to hour and 45-minute drive. So it was pretty far away. The physician actually had only been on site 2 other times, once for the grand opening, one other time. The physician, I know we'll talk about a little more in depth, had never even seen one of the patients prior to them ever receiving any IVs, and we can talk about what that means, had left behind a whole bunch of prescriptive drugs that the basically at the discretion of this unlicensed individual, they could then add these cocktail mixtures. And in this particular case, the unlicensed individual added some substances that should never have been added, was prescription based, needed a prescription, but had it on site, and that ended up believing to cause a heart attack and cause the person to die, to be non-responsive when the paramedic showed up, and then was shortly thereafter declared dead afterwards.
Yeah, and the medical community, we've talked about this. We believe it was the potassium and the electrolytes that were hung.
Yeah,
that stopped
right.
her heart.
Yeah.
Which basically, any medically trained person would know that.
Correct.
And actually many lay people know that, because that's how we execute people on death row in this country, is by hanging potassium. Actually, we do it more humanely, as we sedate them as well, so they don't feel the pain of that. But anyway.
Yeah. And the last piece, just going back to that particular case, if you are running a med spa and you're not on site as a physician, let's just pretend that's allowed in your particular state, you want to have an amazing standing operating procedures, or SOPs, so that if there is an event like this, that you know exactly what you're supposed to do step by step. And they had nothing in place. In fact, she was calling the doctor and before she even called 911. So there's a whole laundry list of things that they didn't even know what to do when they had a bad outcome, because they never really, again, unfortunately, they didn't speak to anyone about the process they should have had in place. So that was another big issue. And you've talked about in your podcast, but for those who are listening to it the first time, this doctor most likely, his license has been suspended at this moment, but
actually it was only suspended for a few months and it was reinstated.
Yeah.
But he can't supervise others.
Yeah. I won't be surprised if something else happens, though, because there's a lot of chatter I've heard from senators in Texas, so not our senator, not the federal side, but the state side, about wanting to change a lot of these rules because of this case.
I can imagine. My feeling about it is that they colluded to make money doing something illegal and killed somebody. I don't think they set out to kill somebody, but it should have been obvious to many people, to any reasonable person, that this could kill somebody, especially with IVs.
Yeah.
So, many people I've talked to really feel like these two should be in jail, but I don't know what's happening.
I know some white collar attorneys and criminal defense attorneys, and they're all wondering if they're going to be charged with manslaughter or something of that sort. So it's definitely a topic. The question is whether or not the district attorney that has the stomach for pushing through that. I mean, there's a lot of things that will happen, including, I'm sure, lots of civil lawsuits too on behalf of that family. But you're right. This person should never have been put in that position in the first place. And unfortunately for the general public, a lot of people, they'll see an IV therapy clinic and they'll think, oh, that must be fine. There must have been somebody regulating it, must be overseeing it. And as Kate, you and I have talked about many times, that's not always the case.
Well, I don't think it's the case at all. I think that although there are so many laws, that's why I'm asking you to be here today. People, first of all, they're different in every state, so that makes it very complicated. And people are just unaware of the law, and they start doing the things, providing the services, and don't even know, some of them don't even know that what they're doing is illegal. So let's talk a little bit about the corporate practice of medicine? Because that's the one part of this that we haven't really touched on yet. So we talked about who can practice medicine, and we talked about proper delegation. So who can you delegate to? And we've talked about who can actually provide some of these services like injecting Botox and hanging IVs. What about ownership? So I feel like this is a big area that a lot of people don't understand. And, I know from listening to your podcast, Legal 123s with Bert Adotto, I love your part. I binged it basically
Thank you.
when I first discovered it. But so corporate practice of medicine, or CPOM, is, makes people's eyes glaze over. So let's try to explain what that is without, losing too many people here.
Yeah, absolutely. And understand that CPOM is a state doctrine. Every state's going to be a little bit different. And it basically, the concept is it's a doctrine that prohibits corporations from employing physicians, which meaning the concept is keeping lay people from employing doctors. And it's very different in every state. About 25 states have their own version of this. So you can take it from the highest level, or like in New York, only a physician can own a medical practice. And again, I'm using the term medical for a reason. While you can jump down to Texas, where I'm seated right now, where a physician and a select few of other types of doctors can co-own a medical practice with the physician, and a physician assistant can own up to 49% in Texas, with the doctor having to have control at 51. Then let's jump over to California, where a physician must own 51%, and other certain licensed individuals can own up to 49%. So again, those three states I just listed, no layperson could have any ownership in those three. And then we can finally jump to Arizona, where the way their laws are written, if a physician owns 1% of the entity, a layperson could own the other 99%. So it's very different. And then you have states like Florida, Ohio, where there is no court practice of medicine, meaning that anyone can own it, but they have to have the proper doctor still supervising those particular facilities. CPOM is really just focused on the ownership side, not about who can actually touch the patient, clearing the patient, supervising the patient. It's just a pure ownership rule. And in going back to state dependence, not only is it different, but like, let's jump to Georgia real quick. In Georgia, they have CPOM very clearly. But both the attorney general there and the medical board said, we have no interest in enforcing it. And so everyone there, even though the statutory says that you have to own, it has to be owned by a doctor, we know a ton of clinics there that are owned by non-doctors, but obviously they still have to be set up correctly with the physician supervision. So that it gets confusing. And hopefully I didn't lose your audience, Kate, when I was going through the steps.
No, I think that's really interesting. And my state of Washington is very similar to the ones where 51% of the practice needs to be owned by a doctor, and then certain medical personnel can own up to 49%. That's my understanding. Yeah. But I learned from you.
Yeah. And I use the term medical for a reason, Kate, because a lot of people, well, what about nurses? Can't they own a medical practice? And the answer is no, they can own an advanced nursing facility. And so states like Washington or Illinois or New York, where they've in Florida, have started passing these rules allowing nurse practitioners to be independent or autonomous, depending on how they write them up, this is allowing them to own it. But if in many of these same states, if like in Illinois, if you're a nurse practitioner and you put med or medical in your title, you're going to get written up by the board because you're not a medical facility. That's confusing to them. You're a wellness center or advanced nursing center. You're not a medical center.
And I find that really interesting. I actually learned that just recently from, I think, the Legal 123's segment from AmSpa recently. I did not realize there was even a difference there, that nurse practitioners are not actually technically practicing medicine, even if they provide many of the same services as a doctor might. I'm curious, though, a lot of nurse practitioners have practices where they say they practice dermatology or some other subspecialty. Is that legally allowed?
So very state dependent in the sense of if your advanced degree is in that, there are some ways in some states for them to say, trained on a dermatologist for blank number of years. My formal education was in internal medicine or whatever it is, or family medicine, and therefore I have an idea how to do that. So in some states, they say, well, okay, if you have a formal education in A, B, or C, and you trained under that particular group, we believe you have the skill set to do that. And so the verbiage they use, to your point, Kate, does get real. You have to be very careful about how the state looks at it. The only state I know, and I think I said this recently that on the podcast, was the only state I'm very well aware of that if you have the term medical in it, in you're a nurse practitioner and they don't care, is in Arizona. For whatever reason, I know that from their nursing minutes, they don't care about that piece. But most states, I know they care. California being one of them, Illinois being one of them, because I know of nurse practitioners who have been investigated because they were using terminologies they shouldn't be using.
Well, that's interesting because I just was looking at one practice in California that was a nurse practitioner who said that they were practicing dermatology. And I find that very difficult as a physician who I practiced radiology for many years and then transitioned into aesthetics that I've been doing now for 10 years. But I never, ever say that I'm practicing dermatology ever.
Yeah.
And when I encounter anybody with any medical derm problem, I refer them to a dermatologist. And I don't think it's right for any doctor to say that they are practicing a different specialty than what they are. And so the idea that a nurse practitioner could just make that up, and not only are they pretending to practice medicine, they're also pretending to practice dermatology. That's really tough for me because that requires 4 years of medical school and 3 years of dermatology residency and to pass the dermatology boards, which the nurse practitioners have done none of those things. So I think that, I don't know, maybe the states also have laws about false advertising, which I think applies to a lot of these things.
Yeah.
Can you comment on that or the laws around what you can advertise?
Sure. So on a medical advertising, there's two different rules you kind of look to. The first one is the federal rules. So the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, they are the ones out there who if you're putting something out there that's deceptive or misleading, they can actually send a notice to you. So the famous story was years ago, it was an IV group that was talking about all the greatness of their IV therapy and how it would do all these wonderful things for you. And I guess the FTC had sent them some letters telling them to take it down. They didn't. And the FTC turned around and popped them for, I believe it was like a couple $100,000 fine. And then for every day that they kept this advertisement up, they had hit them with another like $30,000 a day. So it was unheard of back then that they would go after a therapy group, but because they were putting out so much information that was false, deceptive, and misleading, the federal government said you got to stop that. Well, taking that same language in the medical advertising rules, almost every single state has something very similar, where the medical board says if I show up and say I'm the best injector in the entire world, most boards will say that's false, deceptive, misleading. Now, if you were, recognized as in the I'll use like LA Times Best Doctor of the Year award because the newspaper came up with that, and your collective group of doctors voted you that, or at some aesthetic society you were awarded some lifetime achievement award. You're allowed to talk about that. And that's not false, deceptive, misleading. There's only one case I'm well aware of where this doctor said was the only physician in the world that could do a particular surgical procedure, and somebody reported to the board, but he was, because he had patented and had not taught to anyone else this interesting spinal surgery. So he got dismissed. Funny. But that was the only case I've ever been familiar with that was different than, so if you're on your website, if it says you're the best Botox injector and then 30-mile area, you better have an award that says that, because and medical boards will take you up. Although it's a technical violation, they don't like patients being confused. So that false, deceptive, misleading can get you in trouble.
Okay, interesting. So I have a couple more topics I want to bring up. First of all, we talked about who can own a medical spa and how there's corporate practice of medicine laws in a lot of states, but not all of them.
Right.
That brings up the topic of what is an MSO and How are people using that?
Yes, MSO it means Management Service Organization. The MSO model has been around forever. It is a concept that allowing non-physicians to participate in the enterprise of helping manage and run a medical facility. So typical model that you'll see is there's a management service organization that's owned by non-physicians. It can be owned by physicians too, by the way, and it enters into a contract known as a management service agreement. And then it helps oversee on the business side the medical practice. All the clinical decision making and oversight of the clinicians still needs to be done on the medical side, but the management service organization is going to help run the business day to day, find the space, help modify the website. He might even help find people like, hey, we need to find more RNs. Can you go find and interview them? But then me, the doctor, I still have to make sure that they are a good candidate for these services. MSO serves its purpose. I mean, I've been practicing over 25 years. My very first job, I was an assistant general counsel at MSO, and it had been around a decade before me. So these are not something new that just got into the industry. Most major medical facilities, most hospitals have a background as a management service organization running these organizations because they need that back office, that support to help propel these clinics.
Right. So the picture I want to paint for our listeners is where the corporate practice medicine laws, those are there to protect patients and consumers of these services. And the reason is because they don't want someone else interfering with the doctor-patient relationship. They want the doctor to be able to make the right decision for the patient and not have money or other business things or other corporate reasons to interfere with that decision making. Right?
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
my understanding.
And
And so, go ahead.
yeah, I was gonna say, and don't forget, just because if you're in Ohio, which is a non-CPOM state, that doesn't mean you, the business person, can be making medical decisions. I mean, medical decisions still have to be made by the appropriate medical personnel.
Right. Absolutely. So I think what's happening a lot in the med spa space is people are setting up these things without asking about the laws and ending up owning a spa or a medical spa illegally because they didn't know about CPOM or whatever. And when they find out about it, or if they actually set out from the beginning and know about it, they can form an MSO so they can participate in the business side of the industry. But then they have to work with a physician to run the medical practice. And that's when they hire, a medical director or a physician to run it, oversee it, whatever. And then all the people underneath the physician can carry out the various procedures and stuff, as long as the medical care is overseen properly. Right. So
Yeah.
that's what's supposed to happen.
Yeah.
And I think that what we've pointed out over the last few episodes is just all the bits and pieces, all the places where people are not complying with either part or any of these laws. And that's actually putting patients in danger. And so that's why I've been trying to explain why the laws exist. And so that people can ask questions before they go to a place to make sure that it's really doing it legitimately. Because as you and I both know, and I've mentioned on our last podcast, people are getting injured. Besides this lady who died in Texas, in the headlines over the last few weeks, there have been, as far as I know, about 22 people with botulism from fake Botox that's being illegally purchased on the internet. So that kind of leads me to the last question I had is, what about people who have zero license, so they have no medical license whatsoever, they're not RNs even, practicing medicine completely outside the system, no medical director, no nothing, they're ordering, fake products off of the internet. I recently connected with a young woman who I'm going to have on the podcast in another week or two, who went to a place like that and was scarred for life when this person injected all kinds of ridiculous things in her body. And this person had no license, no insurance, ordered, toxic product off the internet that was tainted with mycobacterium. I mean, what are the laws? Obviously that's practicing medicine without a license, right?
Yeah.
But who's enforcing that? Because this person is still out there doing this to people. This event happened about 4 years ago now. And this girl was in the hospital for almost 4 months.
Jeez.
And yeah, and it's a horrible story. And I don't want to dive into that in this. Well, I'm going to interview her, but basically, the lawyers don't want to take her case because the person had no insurance, and so there's no money in it for them. And so, whose job is it to enforce that law?
Well,
Or what
first
does
off,
even the law say?
yeah. So, Kate, first off, nice teaser for everyone to listen to the whole story. So, I like the way you set that up. But it's interesting is that there are in the vast majority of states. I can't think of one state that doesn't have it. That if you're doing the unauthorized practice of medicine, it is a felony. So that's the first thing to understand, because obviously they want to protect the profession itself. So depending on your state, you have certain states in which the medical board itself takes this very seriously. And if they find out that somebody is doing something that they're not supposed to do, often the first thing they receive is a cease and desist letter from the medical board, saying, "Hey, you should not be doing this, and you're outside. You're not a practicing physician, so stop." And that's like the first step. That's if they learn about it. And for those who don't know, it's not like the boards walk around and walking in for asking you for papers. It's normally either an angry patient that reported you, an angry former employee, or an angry competitor, because you got. And so if your patients have been coming to you and they're doing great, and your competitors don't know you're doing it, you could be running the most illegal operation of all time. But then, so let's go back to the example that you just gave, and then someone is harmed because you're still doing it incorrectly. So that's supposed to be the first line of defense, making sure the medical board is making sure that those who are touching patients are supposed to be the people doing it. Same with the nursing board, making sure if you're saying you're a nurse that you actually are. Are there situations where people are neither? Absolutely. In some states, though, they take it more seriously, where they actually then will go and arrest the person. Now, typically, when they arrest a person, so this is interesting. Well, I'm curious to hear what happens to your story, Kate. So I'll have to listen to the episode. But normally, it's because they maimed or seriously injured or killed the person, because they were doing something they weren't supposed to be doing. So a lot of the times, for many years, when I would see there was arrest as it relates to a med spa or a medical facility, it's because there was unlicensed individuals doing something they shouldn't have done, and they maimed or killed someone. About 5, maybe 8 years ago now, there's a bunch of arrests in Texas where a bunch of individuals in Houston were doing things they shouldn't have been doing. They arrested everybody. Now, the fascinating part, this goes to the police department, said this is the rule, and they arrested him. So many of these people got arrested and had to go in front of medical boards or other things. What we learned later on is the district attorney's like, I don't feel like prosecuting. So they arrested him. Now this person does have arrest for the rest of their life. And technically they could be arrested again if they try to do that. It's the question about the enforcement side. So I'll jump to a story that just happened about less than a year ago in Florida. As you heard Kate us talk about, is you had a physician that was not licensed in the United States, who was basically allowing a medical assistant, undelegated, without good faith exam, without supervision delegation, to inject people. And I guess what we understand is that competitor reported it, and undercover police officer went in and arrested all of them. Now, I still haven't seen what has happened after that arrest, because we don't know. Will the district attorney go forward with the prosecution, or will they end up dismissing it, or will they plead down to something else? Because a lot of times district attorneys' offices are very busy. I worked in one for 2 years in law school. So a lot of cases that come across desks that prosecutors don't want to touch. And the question is, do they feel sophisticated enough to actually enforce that? So that's probably the biggest issue that we're seeing now, is you have people doing things they're not supposed to do, but the board is either overwhelmed, they don't feel like touching it, or the local district attorney, even if the police officer arrests them, doesn't want to go ahead with an enforcement. So that's I think the frustrating part for most people when it comes to this area where you're like, hey, if you're harming patients and you don't know what you're doing, this person needs to be arrested and taken off the streets so they won't harm someone else.
Yeah, well, there was a case in Texas, I think it was 2018. This 26-year-old guy was arrested for practicing medicine without a license. And when they arrested him, the fake Botox that he was using, or the Botox, was labeled in Turkish. And so this came up on a previous episode. But when I Googled that same guy, he's got a practice in, I think this was Houston, actually, still so he got out of jail and went right back to what he was doing. This case that I was talking about earlier happened in California. And I'm curious to know whether the medical board in California would respond if the person didn't ever have any kind of medical license. Is that the medical board, or is that going directly to a district attorney?
Yeah, and so in California, it's not only the medical board, but the attorney general office there gets involved in those kind of cases because it's
Okay.
a state law.
Well, that's really interesting. Well, I I have a interview set up with her coming up. So that'll be, she's basically on a crusade to let people know about her experience because it was so
Absolutely.
awful. She's a young girl and she's got scars all over her body now, and she still has the infection smoldering. So
It's awful.
I know. Well, I'm hoping that the take-home message that we're conveying is that there are actually many laws, and that's why I wanted to bring you on, because I think it's very complex. It's really hard for people to grasp because every state is different and the nuances are different. But the bottom line for everybody is that medicine should be practiced by people who are very highly trained and know what they're doing, generally doctors. That all of what we do in the medical spa space is the practice of medicine and has to be governed by the same laws that we have governing hospitals and doctors' offices. And the risks you run if you have somebody who's not well trained, not overseen, or has no license at all, or is purchasing product and things illegally, is that those things can lead to death, or I hate to say not dismemberment,
Disfigurement.
but but disfigurement in a big way, and can be just extraordinarily harmful. So it's really important to know that the person that you're going to know what their credentials are, know who the director is, make sure that there's proper supervision, make sure that the medical director is there at least sometimes. I always tell people to go ahead and ask to get an appointment with the medical director, because if that's literally never possible, then that medical director is just never on site.
Yeah.
And so that place is probably functioning illegally. And if the person can't point to their license and their experience to prove that they, know what they're doing, that they're also probably practicing illegally. And I think that the consequence for all these people having gotten into the industry illegally is that they cannot legally purchase Botox or fillers or lasers, for that matter, or even the IV supplies, without being a doctor or having a doctor as their medical director. So now they just go on the internet. Well, I can buy anything off the internet. And now they're illegally purchasing as well. And those things aren't manufactured properly. They may be contaminated. You have no idea where they're coming from. They may be shipped in, conditions that are not proper, like it's too hot in the shipping container that's coming from China or whatever. And then, who knows if it's expired? Who knows that, if it's stored properly once it arrives at the place? I'm sure that most people, if anybody's ever had any kind of surgery, they like check your little wristband like twice before they give you a Tylenol, right? And in a med spa, nobody's checking your wristband to make sure that you got, that you're the right person or that you're the right candidate for something. So I really want to thank you so much for being here today. Is there anything that we missed that you think that med spa consumers really should know?
Yeah. First off, I agree with everything you said about making sure you're going to the right place. I mean, just someone might say, I got certified in injecting. That's not, certification's not the same thing as being licensed. So that's the first thing. So I agree with where you're going with that, Kate. And the last piece is, often the case is someone may have worked at a very compliant place, but they were only a small, part of the piece. And so they go, oh, this is how they do it. And then they take something, they start their own business, and they skipped a step. And then someone working for them goes, oh, this is how they do it. And then they skip 2 steps. And all of a sudden, there's all these different people say, oh, I did it just like the way that Kate does it. So I know that she did it correctly. But you've never met this person. They're 5 people removed from you. They think they're set up just the way that Dr. Kate does it. They're like, oh, yeah, Dr. Kate, this is how she does it. This is how we do it. But it's been so diluted, they don't even realize how non-compliant they are. And that's the hard thing for the general public. So your point was really well taken, is like, can I speak with the medical director? Because that at least demonstrates how how compliant they are, and they might not mean to be non-compliant. I mean, most of the time, these people, a lot of them want to be compliant. They just don't even realize what the rules were from the beginning. And then to your story, I know many people in Texas who've gone to what they thought was a good IV bar place or a nurse that was injecting, had no idea about the good faith exam, had no idea that this person should never have owned that facility. And of course, had a bad outcome. And they calling me, again, family and friends, telling me about it. I'm like, yeah, well, of course that's a terrible place. You never even saw a doctor, and of course they can't do that. They're not licensed to do that. So that's the part that I think is harder on the general public than someone like you and I who've been so educated on it.
Yeah, and I think, and I truly believe that the industry has exploded over the last 10 years, in large part because of exactly that phenomenon of people going into their own business and their own practice, really having no idea the depth of danger they're getting into. They don't realize all the medical things they don't know, and they also don't realize all the legal things they don't know. And they may or may not know they're doing it illegally or dangerously, but they are. And I would guess that way more than half of the growth of the industry over the last 10 years is from people doing it illegally.
Yeah, it's probably about right.
Yeah. Well, on that note, thanks so much, Brad, for being here today. I so appreciate your input, and hopefully maybe I can either be on your podcast someday or you can come back. It's been really a pleasure.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me.
If you have a question or a crazy story of your own that you'd like to hear on MedSpa Mayhem, contact us through our website, medspaamayhem.com, or check out our contact info in the show notes. If you learned something and like what we're doing, please tell your friends and give us a 5-star rating in your podcast app. And read the book. MedSpa Mayhem is coming out on June 11th, 2024. Pre-order now on Amazon. You can find the link to pre-order and a link to our website in the show notes. Thanks for listening. I hope you've enjoyed our conversation today about med spa law. In the next few weeks, we'll hear from 2 women who fell victim to the unregulated system and came out of it scarred for life, but driven to share their stories to make sure this doesn't happen to others. I hope you'll tune in next week to hear more. This has been Med Spa Mayhem with Dr. Kate D. We are so grateful you're listening, and we hope you've learned at least one fun or possibly disturbing fact today. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a 5-star review. Oh, and read the book. Med Spa Mayhem comes out June 11th, 2024, available everywhere books are sold. You can pre-order now on Amazon. Links and more can be found in the show notes and on medspaamayhem.com.